Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Antioch fought in 1098 after a grueling siege led by the Seljuk Empire, a coalition more specifically of forces coming from the Emirate of Mosul, the one of Damascus, the one of Homs, plus other Islamic emirates led by Kerboga, the Atabek of Mosul, against the Crusaders during the so-called First Crusade, a coalition including some of the greatest leaders, knights, commanders of the era. Raymond of Taranto, Raymond VI of Toulouse, Adhemar le Puy, Godfrey of Bouillon, Robert II of Normandy, Robert II of Flanders, Hugues of Vermandois, Eustace of the III of Boulogne, Baldwin II of Hainaut, Tancred of Hauteville, Rainald III of Toul, Gaston IV of Béarn, Guglielmo Imbriaco, and Anselmo of Ribeaumont. This video is a traditional tactical reconstruction battle series we carry out on Schwerpunkt by drawing the info straight from the primary sources, the main battle accounts primarily. These are works of historians. There are other letters that provide different kind of information. As we've seen in other videos, when we approach the higher Middle Ages, we start having, often, not always, this was a big battle, as we will see now, so just a very important one in the course of the First Crusade. We start having so many information that we can simply squeeze all into the video per se, because a proper battle analysis wouldn't include just the battle accounts that are, as we will see today, relatively short. At least they can be covered in a format like that. You would have to take into consideration the whole campaign, the whole powers involved. So that would be something way more complicated. Just I tell you that for my master thesis that was dedicated at the time just to a battle and the campaign, it took me essentially 1 year to write in hundreds of pages, and that's a late 13th century battle with tens of accounts, in fact not just of the clash but of all what came before. So if you really want to understand things in depth, probably YouTube is not the best avenue, even though indeed more or less the approach that I use is, I would argue, more useful than other sort of condensed interpretations, because most people just want to know what happened in the battle, but it's not always clear what actually happened in the battle. And I make this kind of videos by reading straight from the primary sources to exemplify this and showing not much the inconsistencies, because there is also this sort of heretical distrust towards the primary source, and you think instead that the scholar will understand anything. If anything, it's the other way around. We must listen very carefully to what these sources say, and it's not just like the fact that they disagree, or that they say something different from one another that should create a problem. On the contrary, that there is a sum of useful information that can be reconciled, even when it's apparently like, one says one thing and the other the opposite, which hardly ever happens in the essence of the whole. So we'll talk more about this stuff in other dedicated videos, perhaps to historical method, because I came across in my research over the years with this kind of things. For example, it's very interesting to look at battles where some external source claims that the outcome was different, especially when there were pretty bad battles for both sides, and so you can't really tell won or lost kind of vibe. We definitely do something different from other channels that just give you that single narrative and say the battle went like this, and they do not actually explain you why we think, when we are often, almost always, not sure whether this is the actually 100%, and it's evidently impossible even just to presume to obtain such a thing, like version of what happened for real, right? So that part of, it's not just finding the solution and say, okay, well, the rest is negligible. It's literally that accounts tell us something that are worth listening, and you do not need to fully reconcile everything in a single narrative where everything makes sense to appreciate those very details, to understand, in fact, this was a much bigger deal than a few battle accounts. This was a battle fought between tens of thousands, and as such, for example, numbers are difficult to assess with precision. Some scholars claim that the Crusaders counted 20,000 men, that the Seljuks had something like between 35 and 40,000. Probably they were both smaller forces, but not by scale. They were surely something of this kind. If you're talking about fighting force, it's possible that the Crusaders had slightly less, and that the Seljuks wouldn't surpass 30,000. In any case, the latter had an evident numerical advantage. They were, in this case, those who had been besieging the Crusaders for so long. And this is, in fact, what I was saying before, for the sake of the broader campaign strategic background. It's interesting to study the history of the siege to realize, obviously, why would the Crusades would come out of the city gates, sally fort, if up to that point they had refused to engage the enemy, because this was evidently deemed to be very strong. And having already, of course, read the battle accounts to make the video, I came across all the before that is very interesting, and again would require perhaps another video just alone to explain, regarding what was going on within Antioch. There were lots of issues between the various Crusader leaders. This is the Crusade of the Barons, that the main sovereigns of Europe were not present. As a consequence, it was difficult, considering it's also the earliest crusade, were more archaic, primitive times here, to properly create a collective discipline, organizing an army, planning a battle, and executing it. However, spoiler, of course, the Crusader victory is a testament to the great effectiveness of Western warfare at this point. Plus, there is all a religious meaning attached to the battle, because that before it, basically the relic of the Holy Lands had been found in Antioch. As you will see, during the same battle, there were multiple saint and angelic visions. So everything gets explained through sources that highly hear evidently about this broader spiritual and moral dimension. We will, again, probably talk about this all on another occasion. Today, we concentrate chiefly, we'll see them in part, but we'll concentrate chiefly on tactics and how the battle was fought, and what we essentially know about the deployment, the timing, the combat itself, and the outcome. Right, it was disastrous for the Muslims. So the primary sources for the Battle of Antioch in 1098 include several key narrative accounts from chroniclers who were either participants in the First Crusade or wrote soon after the events. And the main sources here are Fulcher of Chartres, with his chronicle Gesta Francorum Jerusalem Expugnantium, providing detailed account of the siege and battle from a participant's perspective. Peter Tudebode, known for his Historia de Jerusalemitano Itinere, Tudebode was a priest who marched with the Crusaders. So his account includes personal insights and additional details not found in other sources. Raymond of Aguilers, a chaplain of Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, who wrote the Historia Francorum qui ceperunt Jerusalem. His narrative focuses on the events from the perspective of the Provençal contingent. Finally, the anonymous Gesta Francorum et Aliorum Hierosolymitanorum. This anonymous work, often referred to simply as Gesta Francorum, is one of the earliest and most influential accounts of the First Crusade, including the siege and battle of Antioch. Naturally, it will be a bit more complicated to reconstruct in this way other battles. I have something incoming on, I will not spoiler you, but the subject matter, but pretty important late medieval battles, and say, I don't know, if I were to cover as it's going to happen at some point, I don't know, Tannenberg or any other sort of main, it depends also on the accounts, but as I was saying before, there is so much there. It's just like as you progress also into modern history, Napoleonic warfare, you can't simply talk about every single source of the battle because it becomes huge. So at that point, you have to rely on scholarship a bit more. Yet, and there are battles that can be further analyzed. For example, I can't spoiler this, that I have a video incoming on the deployment of the armies of the Battle of Bouvines. So I already made a video about the Battle of Bouvines, akin to this one in style and method. However, that will focus specifically on something more in-depth that we didn't necessarily deepen in the course of the video, and that literally shows you how, in that case, such armies would deploy for battle. As far as the sources inquiry here is concerned, conversely, for battles like this one, that again are fairly well documented for the era and can be further circumstantiated by other sources, it's fairly easy to read the accounts as we do today and simply look at the battlefield, grasping the fundamentals of what happened and or making different hypotheses regarding things we understand less, and in any case to outline a theory, also based of course on, in my case, my progressed experience, warfare of the era, thinking about by analogy other battles et similia, right? So here again, I marked also the beginning. If you want to have the reference here, it's Fulcher of Chartres, the expedition to Jerusalem, book 120, starting to approach properly to the battle per se, but there is the decision and how they basically established to attack and, the days, etc. But if we talk about the battle, it starts at 23. And so let's simply read this. The battle, the victory of the Christians, and the flight of the Turks. Lo, Hugh the Great, Count Robert the Norman, and Robert, Count of Flanders, were the leaders in the first line of attack. So here, for example, I'm reading from a text, of course, the original is in Latin. Many scholars make this mistake of calling the Acies as line. So the battle line is essentially the single linear deployment of different units that can at some point be in depth, like multiple lines, right? But here the source by Acies really means the sections of this line, right? So it's more like specific units, and the order given here is the one that you can see in the map that we will discuss during the video as well, because it also compounds basically what we know about this deployment. And so you can see all the various Crusader units, how they are separated. This would be the Acies. There is only one line as far as we understand. Except here, as we'll understand, there is, as you can see, that there is an internal subdivision between cavalry that is kept behind, actually, and infantry in the front. Is a very interesting tactic that came handy in the crusading era, in particular for reasons we will explain now, but there are also relatively intuitive, and that yet are actually is still hotly debated among the historians of the Western art of war at this point. So they were the leaders in the first arches, the most important one. So here again, we're talking about Hugh the Great, and then other sources here will give the same, more or less the same list. So as you can see in the map, we're talking about the Christian right. All right, so that's what is meant by the first. Duke Godfrey followed in the second with the Germans and the Lotharingians. After, of course, this was a multinational contingent. The Crusades were mostly a French thing in Outremer, but of course there were, as we've seen also from the list of troops, again, Germans, Italians. The same France is big, like there are Flemish people that are technically in this sense not even French, that there are the Occitans, the Normans, the Siculo-Normans, etc. Now, after them came the Bishop of Le Puy with the men of Count Raymond, the Gascons and Provençals. The Count himself remained in the city to guard it, right, because they are coming out of the city to face the enemy. Bohemond, this is Bohemond of Taranto, the big guy also in many ways, skillfully herded along the crowd in the rear. Here again, we could make enormous considerations if you read critical editions, etc. Of course, you will find plenty of information. We can't cover it all, right? What matters here is getting the fundamentals right, and will be hopefully time on Schwerpunkt to further research this stuff. When the Turks saw that their ranks were being penetrated by the fierce onslaught of the entire Frankish army, they began to dart forward as individuals to shoot arrows, as was their custom. So here, the account, as you understand here, it's not even particularly long. The battle literally is crammed together in just this page, essentially. We will see that there are more detailed accounts, but you want to appreciate the concreteness of the analysis. I mean, as we've seen in many cases, the Franks had the heavier cavalry. The Turks had this problem of being able to soften up the enemy lines to try to disorder them with their hails of arrows, but lacking that counter capacity, unless, again, the enemy was so worn out that their numerical as qualitative elite could face them. So this is what Fulcher seems to be saying, that here there is maybe some kind of chronological overlap, but as the Christians are basically battling with the Turks and they're basically breaking through or in between, the Turks try to put some kind of barrier distance in between and throwing horse archers at them. Of course, this would have most likely happened in the preliminary phase of combat, even though, of course, there was some kind of chase of the heavier towards the lighter. It's not true that heavy cavalry was not effective against the lights, because by definition it is, in the sense that otherwise it wouldn't be heavy or light respectively. The light cannot stand its ground against the heavy, nor it's just simply something that, like in video games, you put on skirmish mode and they're simply gonna evade who's coming at you. So especially with these bigger armies, we do not know too much, as you understand here, about the Islamic perspective. There are, of course, Islamic sources, but they are, generally speaking, later, and they do not, just by historiographical style, provide enough information about the battle. We have read some of them in other Crusading era battle videos, but just for the sake of showing how they have a completely different set of references and interests in the way they discussed history. So the detailed sort of critical inquiry of a battle, in the way the Westerners had always been sort of more thoroughly interested since classical times, is not really there, right? Regardless of the classical studies in the Islamic world, and it's just a different culture, it's a different mindset. That's the reason why also we didn't include these, because again, there are other sources, but they just tell, everybody knows that, as I was saying before, you have, I don't know, 30 sources about a battle, only a handful will tell you how the battle was fought. The rest is just, I don't know, those guys met, this guy won, the other lost, and then no other detail, right? So they literally don't add too much, if not, again, circumstantially to the context, and sometimes it's not so, there is hardly even anything original about it, right? That just this bunch of sources mostly provide you as interesting details. Again, in order to study this, you should put all the sources together, being sure that there are letters, right? So it's a big thing. It would take months to do so, and unfortunately, we have to do else. Again, this does not mean that the analysis per se is flawed. It can be improved, but the tactical fundamentals are exactly what we're looking at through the sources that discuss them. That's the point. You see even how these more famous sources, these more complete sources, are actually pretty concise. We're talking about the 11th, the 12th century. So, but struck by a heaven-sent fear, they all fled. So the Turks, they all fled precipitately, right? As if the whole world had fallen down upon them, which is a beautiful way of describing what happens really when panic at some point escalates across the ranks. So the Franks pursued the fugitives as fast as they could. But because the Franks had few horses, and these were weak from hunger, they did not capture as many of the pagans as they should have taken. However, the tents of the Turks all remained in their camps. In them the Franks found objects of many kinds, namely gold, silver, robes, other clothing, utensils, and many other things which the Turks, in their panic and disorderly flight through their camps, had either left or thrown away. For example, there were horses, mules, camels, asses, magnificent turbans, bows, and arrows with quivers. Korgaba, his Kerboga, fled swift as a deer, he who had so often slain the Franks with ferocious words and threats. But why did he flee, he who had such a large army so well provided with horsemen? Because he dared to contend against God. The Lord, perceiving Korgba's pomp from afar, utterly destroyed his power. Those Turks who had good and swift horses escaped, but the stragglers were abandoned to the Franks. Many of these, especially the Saracen footmen, were taken. This is very interesting because we have seen in different videos, including the one about the Syrian Adat infantry, how there was a Turkic chivalric lordly element grafted on, in this case, literally Syrian towns that had historically different Semitic background, story of urbanization, further fortification as a frontier area. So these are different people. There's local Levi militias, and the Syrian ones are pretty good. Like in the broader Islamic world, especially in the Levant, in the Fertile Crescent, the Syrians have apparently the best militias, the more complex ones, for different reasons that I explained in that video, and also in the other about properly Syrian, and I think it was Jaziran in Iraqi warfare around this year. There wasn't an immense difference, of course, across regions, but apparently the Syrians had more specialized, better organized infantries. They would have been infantrymen here from also other places, including the surrounding mountains of the Mashrek, would be, I don't know, Kurds, other sort of former Byzantine population, things like that, right? So this is the point. They are separated from the Turks that are more, as you know, Central Asian. They have a relatively fresh nomadic background. Then, on the other hand, few of our men were injured. In regard to the women found in tents, of the foe, the Franks did them no evil, but draw lances into their bellies. This is incredibly interesting. I'm sure that here Fulcher had in mind, of course, a double meaning. Lances thrown into their bellies. So you can interpret it in different ways, but the pious sense is that they were put down as basically the concubines of the devil of some sort. And of course, then all in exultant voice blessed and glorified God. In righteous compassion, he had freed them from the cruelest of enemies, those who, placed in great need and tribulation, had trusted him. In his might, he had scattered and conquered state the Turks who up to then had almost conquered the Christians. Our people, enriched by the booty of the foe, returned rejoicing to the city. When the ancient city of Antioch was captured 1102, if two be subtracted therefrom, were the years of our Lord born of the Virgin, in the sign of Gemini, when Phoebus had risen twice nigh. Then on the calends of August died Bishop Adhemar, and may his soul rest in eternal peace. Amen. And then Hugh the Great departed for Constantinople with the consent of the princes, and from thence to France. So this is Fulcher of Chartres, right? And we've seen it. It's really very simple. Let's pass to Peter Tudebode, right? Historia de Jerosolimitano Itinere. So it's useless for me to give you the versions, because some of them you will find them also for free online. You can check gutenbergarchive.org. Depends on what kind of version you really want. So this is chapter 8, Trials, Tribulations, and Christian Victory. And here there is no other sub-paragraph, at least in this edition, and it's a bit ahead in the text. However, there is some information about the siege, about the world context. We skipped that. But we begin with this. Then they drew up 6, lines in the translation. The term used is acies. That is battle lines. Remember this, in this classical Latin, agmen is the march formation, or the unit on the march. Acies is the lined up formation. And here, they had deployed the 6 acies. Bear in mind how these, Fulcher talked about 3, right? Here about 6. Of course, it would be sub-units. We discussed here and there. We'll come back on it. 11th, 12th century armies organization. So we know that there were these this packed formations of knights. The smallest units, tactically wise, being something around 40 knights, or 40 milites if you prefer. I will not descend in these details now. So if you line them up next to one another, there are so many different forces. Here, by the way, we don't even know clearly how many knights, how many infantry. Of course, there are stats of some kind, but we can imagine on an army of, say, 15,000 men, 1,500, being properly milites, right, worth of this name. Then there would have been other mounted troops of some sort. However, infantry is also very interesting and important, including at times the one of some milites that would dismount. Here we don't see them. In fact, this is a functional cavalry action, bringing down the enemy, at least in the final moments. As we've seen, infantry is functional, but it's a functional tandem of the two arms. Combined arms tactics are the ones that everybody enacts. Nobody's out there on their own. So, reading Peter Tudebode, then they drew up 6 arches, let's say better, inside Antioch. In the first rank was Hugh the Great with the Franks and the Count of Flanders. In the second was Duke Godfrey and his army. I will not even digress on the interdependence of these sources. Apparently all derived from a single one that is lost, right? Except for, I think, the last one of the Anonymous, the Gesta Francorum. This is not too important, but bear in mind that if they state the same thing, it's not necessarily because they knew or had that specific, would have written that specific information, but because they were drawing it from another source. Again, this is a philological issue. We get what we get historically wise. The fact, of course, that he wrote that and didn't happen blindly, nor these people were unaware of what had been going on, given that some of them, as we've seen, were properly present in the army. In any case, then continuing, the Norman Robert and his men were in the third group. In the fourth was Adhemar, Bishop of Le Puy, carrying with him the lanks of our Savior Jesus Christ. This is Longinus' lanks that was again discovered miraculously in Antioch during the siege to boost the Crusaders' faith and, in fact, will to fight in such incredibly stressful situations. Consider that, again, there is no king. It's very difficult to keep all these very ambitious leaders under single functional banner, so to say, in terms of tactical performance, but they succeeded because also they were pretty darn good at that anyway, and they understood how difficult the situation was. Along with his troops and the Provençal army, Raymond of Saint-Gilles remained behind in Antioch to guard the mountain because of fear that the defenders of the citadel would attack the city. Because, as we explained in our videos about medieval siege warfare, what normally happened is that even after, as it had happened here, the Crusaders had initially stormed Antioch to be eventually besieged once again by the Turks, still the Turks of the inner citadel of the city existed. Citadels were practically useless in a strictly spatial sense. They were very much isolated per se, that were difficult to access, so they weren't impregnable. Normally they were taken only when supplies ran out, which could take also a long time. However, these forces, like in this case, we've seen them, I don't know, for the Battle of Courtrai, for example, Courtrai, they, given that most battles, like in this case as well, revolved around an army coming to break a siege, you can see how within the city, the Crusaders are still besiegers of the citadel. So it could happen that during the attack, the Muslims in the citadel could think to break out and cause turmoil in the Crusaders' rear guard. So this was an important precaution. Somebody had to remain in the city to check that. Then in the fifth arches was Tancred, son of the Marquis, with his troops accompanied by Gaston of Béarn, with his soldiers and those of the Count of Poitou. In the sixth was Bohemond and his crusaders. Our bishops, priests, clerics, and monks, clad in sacerdotal garments, marched out of Antioch with the army, carrying crosses in their hands, praying and begging God that he save them, and guard and deliver them from all peril and evil. Others stood on the wall by the gate of Antioch, holding sacred crosses in their hands, making the sign of the cross and blessing the army. Thus arrayed in battle formation and protected by the sign of the cross, the Crusaders began to march out of Antioch by the gate which is before La Mahomerie. When Kerboga saw the Frankish army leave Antioch, one formation following another in well-executed maneuvers, he commanded, "Permit them to come out of Antioch, so that we can have a better chance of capturing the main force." The footmen of Hugh the Great and the Count of Flanders first marched out, and then each rank followed in its order. Following the emergence of the Christian army from the city, Kerboga became very apprehensive when he saw the great size of the Frankish forces. So now this is interesting for a number of reasons. Here it appears, like also in other accounts, Kerboga is just wasting time and not taking advantage of this very delicate moment, that is when an army has to pass through a narrow avenue like the gate and redeploy, etc. Here the Crusaders are sending, at least this is what the source says, the infantrymen ahead to begin with. Right? I will not digress on other comparisons, except remember that infantry was not merely passive. We know that in, say, in warfare, that's not quite the case, but very often it could literally as well lead an engagement on its own, provided cavalry would arrive to back them up at some point. So it's not just literally about being, as we were saying before, knee to knee with cavalry, which was the preferable way to go, and in fact the one also employed during the battle. But there could be, like in this case, safety measures taken in this case by the Crusaders to say, okay, let's send the infantrymen first and let them attest on a line defensively, so that as knights we can be sure when they're ready that the situation is under control, we can deploy. Right? This is what seems more likely to have happened here. Consequently, Kerboga instructed the emir, who was commander of the field operation, that if he saw a signal fire rise in the front ranks, that he should immediately sound retreat and withdraw Turkish forces, because he would know that they had lost the day. Which also means that the Crusaders were, of course, a substantial number, as the source itself previously stated, in that the Turks were apparently wary of, if anything, the punching capacity of the Christians, regardless of the fact that, in fact, they had the numerical advantage over them, for the obvious reason that most Seljuk forces were constituted by horse archers and not by heavies, whether cavalry or infantry, like in the Christian field. Kerboga at once, little by little, began to retire toward the mountain that you can see in the map, only to be followed by our army in like moves. Then the Turks split their forces. One marched towards the sea, while the other kept its position. By this move, they hoped to trap our army between the two units. So basically, the notion here is that the Seljuks deploy for battle in an advantageous position on the mountain slope, so to have some kind of protection, probably thinking that they can avoid more complicated maneuvers from the Crusader side on the mountain one as well. And they send a detachment to take the Crusaders from the rear, from the side, towards the sea, so towards the west. Upon observing the Turkish move, our forces formed a seventh line from the troops of Duke Godfrey and the Count of Normandy, and made Count Reinardus commander of it. So this is what you can see in part in the map. Now we will explain why there is Bohemond as well. This unit moved against the Turkish contingents coming from the sea. So in other words, these were a reserve used to parry what was, in fact, an apparently successful Turkish outflanking maneuver. The Turks then engaged them in battle and inflicted heavy casualties with arrows. Our other group drew up ranks between the river and the mountain. So as you can see here from the map, latitudinally, at a distance of 2 miles, the second Turkish force began to advance from their position and to surround our men and to wound them by hurling missiles and shooting arrows. So the standard practice to begin a battle from the Turkish side. In addition, a vast army riding white horses and flying white banners rode from the mountains. Our forces were very bewildered by the sight of this army until they realized that it was Christ's aid, just as the priest Stephen had predicted. The leaders of this heavenly host were St. George, the blessed Demetrius, and the blessed Theodore. Now, this report is credible because many Christians saw it. It seems fair. The Turkish division flanking the sea became aware of their inability to endure more and kindled a grass fire so that the view of it would precipitate the flight of those in camp. At the sight of the signal fire, the Turks seized and fled with all of their prized possession and booty. Our soldiers gradually fought their way to the Turkish tents, where the greatest resistance lay. This is interesting. So, fires were lighted up not just to signal, but especially in this semi-arid weather. We've seen it also in the video about the battle and campaign of Aten, the great Saracen victory over the king of Jerusalem, to literally smoke, to dry up the enemy, to make them thirsty, to make them exhausted, confused, also to prevent them from neatly seeing, which was a Turkish thing because this war bands of horse archers going back and forth normally rose up a lot of dust. On top of that, add the smoke. The sense is that if the Westerners are heavier, they have greater difficulty. You can sort of torment them better with this means. And really screening your maneuvers, your movement from them. It's interesting that the source here states that most resistance from the Turkish side occurred in the camp, which would suggest that at least there hadn't been a major combat, a prolonged engagement in open field, right? In any case, if you need to withdraw to your camp, in that sense, the functionality of your army is done for. So at this point, the battle was already lost for the Muslims. Duke Godfrey, the Count of Flanders, and Hugh the Great rode along the banks of the river. So as we've seen on the right, on the Christian right, where the Turkish strength was concentrated. Protected by the sign of the cross, this force was the first to launch a coordinated assault on Kerbogha's troops. After observing this attack, our other line struck the enemy. The Turks and other pagans then yelled out, and our men, appealing to the one and true God, spurred their mounts against the foe. So here it appears that actually there was more of a battle, which is not taking place in the camp, however. In fact, says it does in the name of Jesus Christ and the Holy Sepulchre, they engage in battle, and with God's help, the Christians overwhelm the infidels. So, if we understand it better, here, from one side, we literally read the tense, right? So, it's possible the tents were not literally the place where the battle was fought, but just, say, in front of them, in front of their camp, right? So, the notion is that the Turks would have just probably fought at that depth of the field because, say, I don't know, the terrain was more favorable for some reason. They had more or less space. It really depends. Consider that against the Christians, the best thing to do, as we've seen here with the detachment, was trying to envelope them in some way. The more concentrated the Turkish forces, the more susceptible to... So the narrower the battlefield, the more susceptible to concentrated Christian heavy cavalry charges they would have been. So for whichever reason, the Turks chose a position that we can't clearly assess due to the fact that who knows where this engagement did precisely take place on the field according to what the source specifically says. So it seems here, by the way, that Duke Godfrey, the Count of Flanders, and Hugh the Great, so the right and in the center of the Christian line, attacked first, and then the other part of the Christian line followed. So that would be the one of Ademar, etc. This is also what happened, as we've seen. The battle width is pretty big, 2 miles. It would not be possible to perfectly coordinate every movement. Normally, everyone has to think about the section of the line that pertains to them. So what mostly they have in front of them, and if there is a suitable situation trying to break the enemy lines, and then the nearby units will react accordingly. Everybody has their own sector. Then the enemy also behaves differently in the various sections of the line. This seemingly brought of course, the right, as we've seen, was the best. As a consequence, they were expected to spearhead the attack. Normally, commanders, the best leaders, were just also in the best condition, with the best troops to do so. So this is how it was supposed to unfold to begin with, ideally. The account says, the shocked Turks took to flight closely pursued by our men as far as their tents. Our Knights of Christ, more zealous to pursue than search for plunder, chased them as far as the Orontes bridge, and at length to Tancred's castle. I will not comment on the latter info because other scholars are puzzled by this as well, because Tancred's castle was probably located across the river, but also behind the Crusaders. So it would be very strange. We do not know whether this is a mistake or whether there were some Turks of the ones from the previous, from the outflanking force that maybe had passed there. This is not so important, right? Here, what matters is that the Seljuk army has collapsed, and so people are fleeing in all directions, but especially towards the east. The Tancred Castle, the Turks abandoned their tents in addition to gold, silver, many trappings, sheep, cattle, horses, mules, camels. You understand how this comes from the same source, by the way. Grain, wine, flour, an abundance of other goods necessary to our welfare. The Armenian and Syrian inhabitants of the area, after news of our conquest of the Turks, circled around the mountain to cut them off and killed as many as they could catch. This is a very interesting detail. You see how different things pop up. Here, the angered Syro-Armenian population, the Byzantinized populations of the region, ambush the fleeing Turks and cut them down. This is really typical. When an army collapses, it loses also its deterrent power, and everybody rises to catch them, right? These people would be either captured or killed just out of revenge, enslaved. Think about the horses, weapons, all goods that could be taken. I made multiple videos about Seljuk warrior fighter types, so if you're interested in their equipment, in their arms and armor, you can check that out, especially in the historical and military units series, but also just the Seljuk warfare one that will be further increased, augmented by this this video. Conquest of the Turks, returned to Antioch joyously, lauding and blessing God who bestowed victory upon his people. Here there is the passage explaining how the Seljuk citadel of Antioch surrendered, of course, as a consequence of the battle, because at that point nobody could save them anymore. But that's pretty much it about the engagement. So let's pass to Raymond of Aguilers. The battle order provided two double lines of Provençals from the troops of Raymond and Adhemar, with footmen in the van attacking or halting on command from their leaders, and the knights following as a rear guard. Right? So here we see, because again, this is the source that mostly takes the Provençal, the Occitanian perspective of the story, offering an explanation of how cavalry and infantry cooperated within the same battle line. In fact, this is what really the deployment consisted in, because again, yes, there were two lines, probably were fairly spaced, but cavalry and infantry were meant, as here the source explains, to support each other mutually, right? Footmen in the van attacking or halting on command from their leaders, and the knights following as a rear guard. As we have seen also from Fulcher, the infantry deploys in the front before, right, the rest of the army, likely exactly to screen the cavalry from the Turkish horse archers. This was a famous tactic, a famous formation employed during the Crusader era because of the obvious vulnerability of horses to the at least large numbers of arrows shot by the enemy horsemen. Telling the truth, we also explain how this is not even the most important aspect in the story. It's not much the fact that heavy cavalry can't cope with light cavalry. They do. But in order to arrive in the conditions to be able to charge into these light cavalrymen, that are, as we've seen, also the majority of the Seljuk forces, you must have really brought them to some degree of exhaustion in their own kind, and or you must have boxed them in certain terrain. If they are still functional, if they're unspent, if they're fresh forces, you don't want to protract the hail of arrows on your horses in particular. The latter do not have much armor, right? Metal armor is fairly rare, especially this early in time among the Westerners and practically anyone else in the East. There is a bit more of attention towards that because, in fact, of the amount of horse archery. This composite bows are not per se just the game changer. The Crusader crossbowmen are pretty darn good and even more effective, telling the truth. However, they have a lot of arrows, and they shoot them in every single situation, which means that given that battles, as you know, last pretty long in time, and you must exactly manage the same in order to be effective in a coordinated fashion with order, not hurrying, etc., you will be fundamentally exposed to this hail of arrows for an unnecessary amount of time. So to make the long story short, having infantry absorbing most of this, given that in battle it will actually have an auxiliary role. I mean, in the moment of the attack, on which basically the entire army, entire tactic was based, right? Given the upper hand that heavy cavalry has on the system, and so therefore an exclusive devotion to attack, because cavalry can only attack. Unless you dismount, at that point you're not cavalry anymore. In fact, the same infantry would take these hits. They would also engage with any enemy horsemen or infantrymen, as we've seen, that would come at them. But then they would leave enough room for the cavalry to attack. And it would be really interesting to see how this mechanism happened. Were corridors large enough at times to let cavalry units pass to charge? Right, and I will not digress on things that we normally don't know, such as I don't know how much space was there actually, especially between the various sections of the battle line. How did infantry and cavalry interacted? At some point, the infantry could simply withdraw itself behind the cavalry, even though it was more likely that simply cavalry advanced and the infantry let them pass in some way, not to give ground to the enemy at that point. Also because that was a bit more the critical moment, which you really needed. The engagement had already started. You really needed to close that gap. You had to allow the heavy cavalry to charge into something. And so hopefully also in these lighter elements, if this is what most of the enemy army actually was, and as we've seen, if they're packed enough, you could really massacre them. And these guys, we understood it from the accounts, would normally flee just at that point when they realized there was no way to come to grip with the knights and coming out of there alive to begin with. So the picture is clear. You have the cavalry following the infantry. That is also advancing, by the way, because the objective of the infantry is, yes, stopping basically when they're attacked, especially by enemy cavalry, heavy in particular, but also light, just to receive them better, right? But still leading, say at least opening the path to the army, to the knights that are really the militaries, are really the soldiers, are really the professionals. Allowing, in fact, the latter to approach the enemy in this sense without spending themselves, without fighting, without having their horses targeted. It's likely in the sense that infantry and cavalry here were pretty well spaced, because as you know, the composite bow has a reach of multiple 100 meters, so you really want to maintain the distances were incredibly neatly calibrated. They literally, you see it also in siege warfare, calculated how long was a crossbow shot to start erecting the camp, exactly that distance. They would surely replicate the same geometry, so to say, in open field, right? And it's likely in the sense that even though this account discusses mostly Provençal forces, that the entire Crusader line fought in that way. In fact, he states, the same order of battle prevailed for the troops of Bohemond, Tancred, the Count of Normandy, and the Franks, the Duke, and the Burgundians. It's interesting how the Provençal source speaks of the northern French as the Franks, And of course he separates the Siculo-Normans, the Normans, and the Burgundians as well. So you see, it's these priceless details that speak volumes about those people's mindsets and how they saw the world and each other. It's really incredible. Heralds scurried through Antioch, urging each man to fight with his leader. The order of the march was set as follows: Hugh the Great, the Count of Flanders, and the Count of Normandy first. The Duke, the Bishop, and finally Bohemond. So again, it's pretty much what we get, especially from the right to the left, with decreasing accuracy, or at least agreement in the sources. In this manner, they fell into their proper ranks below the city and before the bridge gate. Oh, how blessed is the nation whose Lord is God, and the people whom he has chosen for his own inheritance. Oh, how changing was the appearance of this army from sloth to activity. Only a few days before, the leaders and nobles walked the streets of Antioch imploring God's help, and the commoners, crying and beating on their chests, were barefooted through the city. So dejected were the Christians that father and son, brother and brother, exchanged neither salutation nor glances as they passed on the streets. With the sudden change in spirit, one could see the Christians go out and, as spirited horses, rattle their arms, wave their spears, and boisterously celebrate with acts and speeches. But why delay this story? The will to fight was now granted, and the plans of the chieftains were executed. In the meantime, as Kerboga played chess in his tent, he learned that the Franks were marching out to fight. Troubled in his soul at this unexpected move, he summoned Myrdalin, a Turkish refugee from Antioch, and well-known courageous nobleman, and inquired, "What goes on? Because the Franks were small in numbers, did you not report the outnumbered Christians would never fight me?" To this query, Myrdalin answered, "No, sire, I made no such report, but follow me and I shall observe them, and advise you, if you can, overwhelm them easily." As our third rank of crusaders advanced, Myrdalin scouted our ranks and told Kerboga, "The Christians will die before they flee." Kerboga in turn inquired, "Can some of the Christians be pushed back a little?" Then Myrdalin answered, "If all the pagan world rushed against them, they would not budge a foot." Despite his apprehension, Kerboga formed his great army into battle order and permitted the Crusaders to march out of Antioch unmolested, although he could have blocked them, as we said before, by the way. Fearing encircling tactics from the rear, our forces turned their battle lines toward the mountains, which were 2 full miles from the bridge. So we see here the distances return to. Again, there is likely a common source to this main accounts. That's most of the reason. In typical clerical procession, we advanced, and may I add, it was a procession. Priests and many monks wearing white stoles walked before the ranks of our knights, chanting and praying for God's help and the protection of the saints. Nevertheless, the Turks attacked and shot arrows. But Kerboga, no longer deaf to Christian proposals, suggested to our leaders that 5 or 10 Turks should fight the same number of Franks, and following the outcome, the army represented by the conquered knights should leave the battle in peace. Our men responded, "You refused when we wished this, but now that we are ready for battle, let every man fight for his rights." As stated, we were arrayed on the plain when a detachment of Turks to the rear of us attacked a contingent of footmen. We wheeled and met the attack courageously. This is very interesting because it shows what we were saying before about the infantry tactical autonomy of the era. Basically, these Turks would have attacked like from a unforeseen angle of some sort of flank, rear even. The infantry is able to wheel and to receive them, right? I will not digress on the broader, and as obvious practice that is often underrated regarding how did actual units really perform. Like we have the sense cavalry was stronger, infantry was so, but we do have to realize that infantry was always capable to do certain things in history, such as just wheeling, for example, as a unit. Here we do not know how large it was. It would be interesting to know, but evidently there was some specific autonomy to the infantry that, especially against this lighter horsemen, came really, really handy. The enemy troops, unable to budge the footmen, in fact, kindled a fire around them so that those undaunted by swords would be swept away by fire. We explained before what was the purpose of this fire as well. Because of the extremely dry grass, there was a forced withdrawal. So that's a hell of a torture. Now, with our army outside of Antioch, barefooted, priests clad in priestly vestments stood upon the walls, invoking God to protect his people, and by a Frankish victory bear witness to the covenant, which he made holy with his blood. But in the advance from the bridge to the mountain, we struggled mightily because of the encircling Turks, and in the course of this, the enemy rushed upon those of us who were in Adamar's ranks. So this would be the northernmost, the unit section of the Crusader line on the left, on the far left. Superior in numbers, they neither wounded anyone nor shot arrows against us, no doubt because of the protection of the Holy Lands. I was both a witness to these events and bearer of the Holy Lands. Furthermore, if the rumor is spread that Heraclius, standard bearer of the bishop, was wounded in this melee, let it be known that he gave his standard to another, and was far from our ranks. With all of our soldiers outside Antioch, our princes, as already stated, had formed 8 arches. But 5 more, so here we have yet another number, but 5 more appeared in our lines, thereby giving us 13 ranks. Likewise, we shall not pass by this memorable event, one in which the Lord loosed a small but welcome shower as the Christians advanced into battle. Its drops brought to those touched by it such grace and strength that they disdained the enemy and charged forth as though nurtured in regal style. The shower affected our horses no less miraculously. In proof, may I ask whose horse broke down before the fight's end, although it had eaten nothing but bark and leaves of trees for 8 days, because this had been the problem also during the siege. The dwindling supplies. When do you attack? Like if you have a cavalry-based army largely, the horses must be well nourished to be effective. And so here, this rain is really a divine blessing. Because God added soldiers to our army, we outnumbered the Turks in battle, although previously we appeared outmanned. Right? Here, of course, there isn't too actual information about the battle itself, and even some passages, including the one of the wheeling infantry, eventually stops there. Like, what happened in terms of those attackers? Upon completion of our advance and battle formation, the enemy fled without giving us an opportunity to fight, and our troops then chased them until sundown. The Lord labored surprisingly well with men and horses, for the men were not deterred by avarice, and those famished horses, scarcely led from their scanty provender into battle by their masters, now pursued without difficulty the best and fleetest Turkish steeds. Made a very early video about the myth. In fact, it's Western mounts would not be adequate to chase, say, these Central Asian runners. This is true for the lighter type of troops, the horsemen in particular, that the Muslims had, not just in the Levant, but say in Spain. This is an interesting information. Besides, here the notion is that the Crusaders do not stop, we've seen it in the other sources as well, to plunder simply, but they chase the enemy as much as they can, because they want really to get rid of the problem. Consider that they had been oppressed by these guys for so long. They had been freaking out about being besieged. They thought that the Turks were impossible to defeat at some point. So they were surely much more motivated to exploit that moment of enemy helplessness. the Lord reserved this further pleasure for us, namely the defenders of the citadel. And so this continues in this regard, and there is all the... Says, on the other hand, hardly a footman survived. Despite their horrible and terrifying battle, few Turkish knights perished. This is the interesting aspect. It may almost seem, given that all accounts say that there was hardly any combat, that most enemy forces fled, taking losses also in the pursuit, but it brought to mind the flight of the Syrians at Samaria when a measure of flour and barley was bought for a shekel. These events happened on the vigils of St. Peter and St. Paul, and appropriately so, because through these saintly intercessors the Lord Jesus Christ brought this triumph to the pilgrim church of the Franks. Indeed, it was our merciful Lord who lives and dwells with his servants through all eternity. Amen. Let's pass to the anonymous Gesta Francorum et Aliorum Hierosolymitanorum. The anonymous, however, expresses the same exact text as Fulcher of Chartres, so it's useless to read because we've already read it. It's literally identical. Now, what about this battle? So there are some indications, essentially, that the Seljuks had planned an ambush, right? The fact that Carboga, for example, allowed the Crusaders to come out. The indications that we have from the accounts was a diversionary attack, at least a flank attack that at some point was met by the Christians as well, is also there. We know from, there's a little detail from a later source, like from a century later, in the Islamic annals, that in fact some of the Seljuk commanders had been set in ambush. We do not really know what that means. There's no extra information really. The direction, what they had to do, whatever, right? This is Ibn al-Athir, by the way. This idea that the Crusaders could be lured outside, also preventing the siege to further go on and consume, in fact, Islamic resources. Consider that these troops were coming from Mosul at large. Just think how costly it was at that point to wage a campaign like that and to besiege a city like Antioch, right? So everybody was in a pretty difficult situation. Regarding the troops that were employed to stop the flanking attack, it's possible that Bohemond, that was on the left flank, intervened ahead. He was the same one to send Reinald to stop them. Bohemond was really the soul, the spirit of this battle, the relative battle plans. Again, by reading the previous parts of the texts, it's sort of readily evident. Thus, it's equally possible that the Christian army was de facto saved by this counter-attack on the left, aimed at, in fact, taking out the Christians entirely. We have, as we've seen, this notion that there were infantrymen that couldn't quite escape. And it's possible, I mean, from the Seljuk side, that were actually Syrians. Likely, but local militias. Thus, it's possible that some of these people took a stand somewhere before being wiped out by the advancing Crusaders. That wouldn't go to ahead advancing for long as well. I'm providing you here something also from other circumstantial evidence, either minor sources and or some scholarly interpretation. The historiographical consensus, however, is that more than what we have read and what we could grasp from this, we can't fully picture. As you understand here, the Christian sources is very celebratory, not just of the victory, but also of the religious meaning behind that. The visions of the saints that come to fight next to the Crusaders, this miraculous reign, etc. So there is literally a sense with the Holy Langs on the battlefield that there is a great motivation, one that is either like now or never. Like either we break the Turks now, or it's done. And basically, regardless of the difficulties that would occur further in the campaign, this was a major turning point in the Crusades. The First Crusade could really have brought to an end of the same had the Turks succeeded. So the impression from major battles like this is that in general the odds are very well balanced. So for up to a certain time, things can really tilt in both directions. There was an actual struggle. Here, according to the sources, as you've seen, it seems like the Christians simply charged into the enemy and they triumphed. This is not unrealistic in the sense that, of course, there would have been a frontal clash, that this is how these armies fought. In that, of course, the Turks were disadvantaged at hand-to-hand combat. That's why they attempted a diversionary attack. The Christians would have not had a great possibility to pre-plan, ambushes, to deploy troops somewhere else. They may have attempted to do so, but we don't have any explicit evidence of this. We see, however, and highly commend the Christian capacity to very cautiously and effectively take control of the terrain, sending infantry out, almost scouting this, pairing, as we've seen, with the same infantry, part of the flank attack that was directed at the Crusader forces. And it seems from this evidence that in practice the threat posed by the flank attack was never quite nullified during the battle. At least there is no specific evidence of this attack being completely thwarted, which may actually have to do with the fact that there was, if we want to follow the map here, to some kind of combat taking place there where the main one was occurring. Conversely, the sudden collapse of the Seljuks, apparently without too much of a fight, we've seen that the same Christian sources say that there weren't too many horsemen killed at the end of the day from their side, or at least maybe of the heavier type, we don't know. The sense being that there was some kind of, if not orderly, but properly pre-established retreat. As we've seen here, the sources represent Kerboga as hesitant and relying on different figures, some of which we are not even entirely sure who they were. They may have been invented, maybe at least they may not find a correspondent linguistically to figures maybe we actually know, and that, however, are not mentioned in the sources with the same names. This would also point at the fact that if, as it's likely, the Seljuks had planned to attract the Christians into an ambush, given the obvious advantage that this position outside the walls had conferred them in terms of terrain choice, etc., some Turks detached from the main body, maybe the ones that would have had to carry out the flank attack, the ambush, so to say, would have actually defected at a point. It's possible that they may have reciprocated this depending on the outcome, as we've seen. Fulcher of Chartres literally says, and also the Anonymous with him, that basically they had said, if you see a fire, retreat, right? Literally something that Kerboga would have delegated to this detachment, which is weird because he was with the main body. And so the notion in that case would be that he would have feared the Crusaders, and if the flank attack had not succeeded, there was no way to simply take them out. This, however, suggests, if it was a trap, if they allowed the Crusaders to come out, right, exactly hoping to make them fall into a trap, and so not much because Kerboga was waiting or wasting time, as the sources suggest, to a degree. There was actually a pretty fought battle in between that we can't even quite fully see, and it was pretty stressful also from the Christian side, to say the least. So it's not entirely clear what happened. Unfortunately, we will, so to say, never know, because we're literally being told, but by sources that are evidently not interested in telling us pretty much like the technique of it all. They're much more satisfied, of course, with the outcome and with the broader meaning, importance that this had, considering all the holy enterprise and all what this meant in the bigger picture, which of course was more important to them, and not because of any fault. All right, it was already a big deal for these sources to write, also with such level of detail. It's, again, probably we will digress at some point on the before. There are lots of quarrels in the Crusaders' side. There is all the religious revival, finding the Holy Lands. So it's a very famous passage in the history of the Crusades that we will see better. But as far as the battle is concerned here, what stands out is, as we were saying before, how good the Christians were to deploy in a favorable, in a way that would favor them on the battlefield. How the Seljuks basically let them do it, and how flexible these formations really were. How even the infantry alone could be trusted to take up position and shelter the knights, and even parry some fierce attacks from the rear that would have been at that point resisted to by the cavalry as well, that stands in reserve. We understand that it was an important complexity from the Seljuk side as well that we can't fully picture. But as you understand, the basic tactics involved here, aside from the aforementioned cooperation between cavalry and infantry from the Crusader side and, say, heavy and light cavalry from the Seljuk one, shows a pretty straightforward battle, especially considering if we're talking tens of thousands from both sides. Like, this was also practically the only way to go with it. So in this engagement frontally, the Muslims hope to soften up the enemy lines enough to overwhelm them just with numbers. We don't know how terribly devastating, in fact, this would have really been. The fact that the Christians themselves chose the type of deployment with the infantry taking most of the enemy arrows and leaving the cavalry out of that is something quite telling. We think that regardless of some partisan claim, of course, this was the standard practice across not just like the Crusader battle line in this case, but pretty much among Crusaders at this point to cope with the Seljuks that had already been met, like in previous battles, that ended up in similar ways in terms of about Dorylium, for example, where yes, the enemy can shoot all those arrows, but then what, right? And they don't manage to break the enemy. at the end of the day. So this is a bit the equivalent on the field. Surely there is a Seljuk superiority. This is really normal. Numerical superiority is really normal in the Crusader era. Like it's really obvious for reasons we explained in different videos about Seljuk warfare, for their armies to be filled with not particularly reliable, but still fairly effective, especially en masse horse archers. There was a sort of predatory lifestyle of many of these people. Okay, they could come really from very far away at times. I'm searching for my own playlist because we talked about the Seljuk army organization, if I'm not wrong. So you just curious, but you know where to search. Yeah. I know we haven't really talked about army organization. We'll have to do it better. But we made enough videos explaining a bit of things. We also talked about the Battle of Azaz that would be fought 27 years later. The fundamentals would have not really changed too much. However, what is striking in the picture is how, in fact, relatively simple and straightforward the strategic principle behind this battle is, right? And how good, again, the Crusaders are in putting themselves in between the main Seljuk forces and the quite likely, because I think they expected that to be outflanking detachment of Turkish forces. And what matters here is not much having envisaged that all this could and would happen, but having had the organization, the discipline, the training, the order, the calm nerve, the cold blood, to be able to fully deploy just in one shot with, again, horses that, as we've seen, had not eaten for a long time, in a pretty difficult situation with the entire enemy army in front of you. It's scary, right? And it is really we know how resoundingly the Christians won, but before that happened, it was, of course, not to be given for granted. Just the idea of stepping outside in that situation is scary, if you think about it, and may have negatively influenced the same order, right? Kerboga was rightly gambling because he knew, by the way, the divisions, the divergent opinions, so to say, of the Crusaders within the enemy camp. He knew about all the possible things that could go wrong from the Crusader side. He counted perhaps also on the remaining Seljuks within Antioch citadel, right? As we've seen, apparently the same Kerboga took up when the Christians set forth, because this was sudden, a better position closer to the mountains, showing that there wasn't perhaps much that could be done in terms of maneuver aside from the flank detachment with a bigger force, but to wait along those slopes. We will never fully know how the whole thing unfolded, and again, who fought where exactly. We're told, as we've seen, that the Christian right attacked first. This is because essentially the main road back to the east that would have favored the same Seljuk transit is located on that side along the Orontes River. That would have in fact created problems to those who were deployed on the Seljuk right, towards the mountain slopes. In fact, it's possible that those infantrymen that were caught were attested there also because they would have been more confident as infantry just to be repaired in some way in the open. If you're a Seljuk horseman, you can flee at some point. And again, we're told that not too many of them died after all, at least in the fight. In the pursuit, probably also, but still, the Seljuks ruinously flee. They abandon their own camp, as we've seen with lots of goods there. So what we seem to miss from their narrative is mostly what happened in between, the big engagement, which is sort of implicit, like this Crusade era battles, especially in the first period, are very much concerned with. You understand there is a similar rhetoric, aside from the fact that they're basing themselves in this specific battle on the same source, but you see all this emphasis on the moral side of the story, on religion. It's kind of obvious. It's perfect with the time. It really shows you how realistically living within this order of ideas they were. But the moment of the fight is often skipped. It's very short, at least, and it doesn't really, especially these are clerical sources, they do not digress too much on that. They're, of course, militarily literate enough to realize this thing of flank attacks, of how troops were deployed. Here, for example, all the arches, all the various ranks forming the battle line. It's very interesting to see how they would have been conceptualized, how many there were. It's not even entirely clear. But the sources are responsive to such details. Combat is combat. And at the end of the day, I think it's a fair and accurate representation of the battle because it is really about moral force versus moral force. So what can you say about combat, right? Do you want to descend into how one guy fought and the other didn't? Like, nobody cares, usually, in historiography about this kind of things. Also, in moments of where these battle descriptions are much more insightful, right? It's more a matter of a collective matter. So again, it's possible that something went wrong from the Seljuk side in terms of command. One leader defected. This was also a coalition, by the way, so the Crusaders weren't the only ones to have a relatively split command, relatively fragmented one in terms properly of mostly were counts, dukes, that was no king again. Among the Seljuks it was actually a similar story because the heavily Persified Seljuk Turks were very feudal, right? As we've seen here, the various contingents came from different cities that had to different provincial centers that had different levels of interest in this whole story. But of course, were committed at least to try to stop the Crusaders, and especially to wipe their army entirely out. So if they wanted to, this is a strategic decision. If they didn't want the siege to go too much on, they decided to give battle at that point. What happens in the battle pertains to tactics. It's not affected by strategy. If not, of course, in a measure, but at that point it's affected by politics rather, in the measure some leader, in fact, defected and or had some better ideas of what to do in a way or in another. It's also fascinating to read that the local Armenians and Syrians began to kill the Seljuks as the battle was lost, right, from the countryside, etc. So that is realistic that happened. So probably here we're looking at a very big battle where lots of very interesting things would have happened also in the tempo of the action, etc. But these essentials that we can still grasp thanks to the sources and general knowledge about those times warfare is greatly unseen and unexplained, at least, or undescribed, something that simply does not shine through in a more visual fashion through the sources. This is mostly as it is, and we have to accept it. It's only fair for such an era to have this much information already. By the way, other inconsistencies or other information can be found here and there. This kind of videos are designed to essentially stimulate some kind of tactically analytical logic and criticism. Then, by talking about all the other various troops, types, armies, organization, other battles, by the way, tactics in general, like, we, of course, know why something would be more or less accurate or not. That's why history, in the sense, is not an opinion in the sense that everybody can think whatever they want, right? This is really not what the word really is about. We came back to Crusader warfare, which we will be doing. There was a time in Schwerpunkt's early days in which, for some reason, we made a fair amount of Crusade battles videos. Battle videos, and let me check this. We made bit of videos about the Crusades, because there is really a lot about Crusades, actually, because I inserted in the playlist practically everything about Holy War, Crusades of every era, right? So it's a bit bigger. And it's also a playlist that, in fact, got a fair amount of views. I wish if anything, some of these videos are old, right? Had I done them today, they would have been better made. But overall, I'm satisfied with what we have still to create other playlists about it. The more we go on, the more we add, and so we will probably homogenize or in any case improve all the content as far as we go. Here, maybe Crusader States. Yeah, this is slightly more pertinent to the Crusader States, yeah. We didn't make too much, no. We made these are the battles we made since the beginning. The Battle of Ramla. This is the third Ramla, August the 27th, 1105. Battle of Azaz, June the 11th, 1125. The Battle of Atten, July the 4th, 1187. Battle of Cresson, May the 1st, 1187. Battle of Aran, May the 7th, 1104. Battle of Ager Sanguinis, June the 28th, 1119. So it's actually fairly a lot. There's also the Battle of Pelagonia, that's in Greece, though, in Romania at the time. We're in 1259. But these ones are... how many? 6, 7? And those are all old videos, so to say, old ones that are not bad overall in explaining the whole thing, but of course could have, were I to make them today, they would be better. In any case, I was glad to talk about the Battle of Antioch, because it's also a pretty famous one. There is a great mystique behind it. We will investigate better in other videos. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.